On September 2, 2003, in the quiet town of Belleville, Idaho, 16-year-old Sarah Marie Johnson murdered her parents, Alan and Diane Johnson. That much, many true crime enthusiasts already know. But here at Voices of the Vanished, we're not just recounting stories, we're here to deconstruct them. If you're looking for a simple retelling of the facts, there are dozens of other channels for that. But if you're ready to dive deep, to analyze the glaring errors, the subtle before and the devastating after, exploring the psychology, sociology, and forensic medicine that truly unravel this tragedy, then you've found your home. We'll quickly summarize the events and then we'll peel back the layers, examining the almost unbelievable mistakes, the hidden tensions, and asking the crucial question, beyond the crime, what could have been different? Welcome. Let's begin. On September 2, 2003, a Tuesday that should have been ordinary, the peaceful community of Belleville, Idaho, was abruptly awakened by the sound of gunshots. Shortly after, a distressed emergency call reached the Blaine County Sheriff's Office. A panicked neighbor reported hearing shots next door and that the resident's 16-year-old daughter, Sarah Johnson, had run to her door, screaming that her parents had been shot. When officers arrived at the Johnson residence at 102 Main Street, they found a horrific scene. Diane Johnson, 52, lay dead in the couple's bed, with a single gunshot wound to the head, struck while she slept. Beside her, on the floor, was the body of her husband, Alan Johnson, 46, with a gunshot wound to the chest. He was dressed only in a towel, indicating he had just stepped out of the shower. The house showed no signs of forced entry, and the scene appeared strangely clean except for the blood. A .25 caliber Winston rifle was found on the bedroom floor, and, peculiarly, 2 kitchen knives were arranged at the foot of the bed, with a third found on the bed of the couple's son, Matt. Initially, the investigation focused on Mel Spiegel, the tenant of the guest house on the Johnson property, whose rifle was the murder weapon. However, Mel had a solid alibi, confirming he was in Boise, Idaho at the time of the murders. As clues accumulated and the absence of an intruder became increasingly evident, investigators' eyes began to turn to the only unharmed person in the house, Sarah Johnson herself. On October 29, 2003, Sarah Marie Johnson was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. 2 years later, on March 16, 2005, at the age of 18, she was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This is the story many know, but for us, at Voices of the Vanished, it's just the beginning. Now, let's deconstruct this crime, delving into the mistakes, the motivations, and the lessons it offers us. With the basic facts established, it's time to go beyond the superficial narrative. At Voices of the Vanished, we believe the true story of a crime often reveals itself in the details, especially in the mistakes made by those who try to cover it up. And in Sarah Marie Johnson's case, these errors were so blatant they became the backbone of the prosecution. Let's deconstruct the aftermath of the crime, starting with Sarah's amateurish attempt to manipulate the scene. The failed staging, a poorly written script and inverted logic. When police entered the Johnson home, the absence of forced entry or signs of struggle was already a strong indicator that the assailant was not a random intruder. But it was the additional details that began to paint a disturbing picture. 2 kitchen knives were found at the foot of the bed, where Diane lay dead, and a third on Sarah's brother Matt's bed. Sergeant Walt Famling, the lead investigator, expressed the team's perplexity. Why are these knives placed the way they are? And what does that mean? Here, Sarah's foolishness or naivety manifests glaringly. Why would a killer who used a .25 caliber rifle, a powerful and lethal firearm, bother to scatter kitchen knives on the floor? The logic of a robbery gone wrong or an intruder's attack crumbles. A thief wouldn't use a shotgun and then leave knives as a calling card. This action suggests a desperate and ill-conceived attempt to stage a scene, perhaps inspired by horror movies or true crime stories Sarah consumed, but without an understanding of forensic reality. It was the first sign that Sarah's script was poorly written. And where was Matt, Sarah's brother? Why wasn't he a suspect? Matt, 22, was studying at the University of Idaho, hundreds of miles from Belleville, and had a solid alibi, which quickly eliminated him from the investigation. His absence from the crime scene and his unquestionable alibi contrasted sharply with Sarah's presence and suspicious actions. Desperate disposal, clues in the trash and plumbing. But Sarah's most glaring errors occurred in her attempt to get rid of the evidence. In the post-crime panic, she threw the pink bathrobe she was wearing, latex and leather gloves, and .25 caliber ammunition into the household trash. She believed the garbage truck, which was scheduled for that day, would erase her tracks forever. Fortunately, Sergeant Famling's keen insight saved the investigation. He ordered the garbage truck to be intercepted before it could carry away any evidence. And there, amidst the ordinary trash, were found the items that would become crucial evidence. This is not the behavior of a calculating criminal, but rather someone in desperation without a sophisticated plan for concealment. And why did Sarah turn the bathrobe inside out? This question reveals an attempt at concealment, but in a naive way. The idea was likely to prevent blood spatter from getting on the outside of the bathrobe, which might be seen. By turning it inside out, she hoped the inner part, now exposed, would absorb the blood and could be discarded without leaving visible traces on her clothes. However, this maneuver failed spectacularly, as forensics found high-velocity spatter on the back of the bathrobe, proving she was facing away from the shot and that the concealment attempt was ineffective. And as if that weren't enough, in an act of pure panic and lack of discernment, Sarah tried to dispose of a shower cap, which she used to protect her hair from blood spatter, down the toilet. The result? A clog that brought plumbers to the scene and consequently led to the discovery of another vital piece of the puzzle. The shower cap, such a trivial object, became irrefutable evidence of her presence and her clumsy attempt at cleanup. The inconsistencies, a story that didn't hold up. When Sarah was interrogated, her story began to crumble under the scrutiny of investigators. She changed her version of events multiple times. Sometimes she was sleeping, sometimes awake, sometimes in her parents' room, sometimes outside it when the shots were fired. She also had difficulty remembering whether her parents' bedroom door was open or closed. These inconsistencies were not just memory lapses. Ballistics and blood spatter analysis proved that both doors, her parents' bedroom and Sarah's bedroom, were open at the time of the shootings. Bone fragments and blood spatter were found on Sarah's bedroom wall, physical proof that she was not isolated in her room as she claimed, and that the violence had extended there. Sarah's story simply did not align with the reality of the crime scene. The irrefutable forensic evidence, science against lies, forensic science, sealed Sarah's fate. On the pink bathrobe, which she wore inside out, high-velocity blood spatter patterns were found on the back, indicating she was facing away from the source of the gunshot. Now, you might be asking yourself, but if she was facing away from the shot, wouldn't that make her innocent? Or mean she wasn't the one who fired? That's a very pertinent question, and the answer lies in forensic interpretation. High-velocity blood spatter indicates that the person was extremely close to the source of the blood at the moment it was expelled, that is, at the moment of the shot. The fact that the spatter hit the back of Sarah's bathrobe means that yes, her back was turned to the victim at the instant the blood was projected. However, this does not exonerate her. On the contrary, it confirms her presence and intimate proximity to the crime scene at the exact moment of the shootings. She was there, mere inches from the victim, when the crime happened. Whether out of panic to shield herself from the visual impact or due to the dynamics of the shot itself, the blood hit her back. This evidence, combined with her DNA on the gloves, gunshot residue on the gloves and bathrobe, the blood of both parents on her garments and her inconsistent story, forms an irrefutable picture. The spatter on her back does not exclude her as the perpetrator. It merely details the dynamics of the moment, placing her at the center of the violent action and confirming her direct involvement. Sarah's DNA was found on the inner lining of the latex glove. Gunshot residue was detected on both the latex and leather gloves and on the bathrobe itself. And, crucially, the blood found on the gloves and bathrobe belonged to both Alan and Diane Johnson. Each of these pieces of evidence on its own was damning. Together they formed a mountain of proof that completely dismantled any claim of innocence. Sarah's mistakes, born of inexperience and panic, were meticulously collected and analyzed, transforming into silent and irrefutable witnesses to her guilt. This is proof that, even in the darkest crimes, the truth always finds a way to emerge, often through the most basic failures of the criminal. With the deconstruction of Sarah Marie Johnson's mistakes, it's clear that her attempt to cover up the crime was as flawed as it was desperate. But to truly understand the tragedy, We need to go beyond the after and delve into the before. What led a 16-year-old girl to murder her own parents? At Voices of the Vanished, we seek out the hidden tensions, the psychological conflicts, and the social pressures that can push an individual to the abyss. The family conflict, a rebellion that escalated. The Johnson family from the outside seemed like a typical middle-class American family in a small town. Alan, a hunter and family man, and Diane, a dedicated cook and mother. But behind closed doors, a silent battle was being waged, centered on their youngest daughter, Sarah. Sarah was deeply in love with Bruno Santos, a 19-year-old Guatemalan immigrant. For Sarah, Bruno was the embodiment of freedom and passion. For her parents, he was a threat. Alan and Diane's disapproval was vehement. The age difference, Bruno's immigration status, his involvement with drugs and minor offenses, all of it was unacceptable. They saw Bruno as a bad influence and feared for their daughter's future. This prohibition, however, had the opposite effect. Instead of pushing Sarah away from Bruno, it drove her even closer to him, transforming the relationship into an act of rebellion against parental authority. Sarah began lying about where she spent her nights, often staying with Bruno. When her parents discovered these lies, the tension in the house reached unbearable levels. The bad boy love and adolescent fantasy, an impossible dream. For Sarah, the relationship with Bruno wasn't just a romance. It was the materialization of a bad boy love, or rebellious love, a fantasy of a rebellious life that many teenagers see in movies and pop culture. In her 16-year-old mind, coming from a middle-class family in a quiet town, Bruno represented excitement, danger, and an escape from a life she considered suffocating. She dreamed of building a life with him, a future that, in reality, was completely unfeasible for a teenager without resources and with a boyfriend in an irregular situation and involved in illicit activities. This romantic idealization, fueled by immaturity and a search for identity, created a bubble of fantasy that disconnected her from harsh reality. Her parents' threat to destroy this dream was what pushed her to the brink. Bruno's subtle and dangerous influence. Although Bruno Santos was not charged with direct involvement in the murders, his influence over Sarah is undeniable and crucial to understanding the crime's dynamics. He was older, had a more marginalized lifestyle, and represented everything Sarah's parents feared. It's reasonable to infer that Bruno, even if he didn't explicitly order or encourage the murder, exerted a significant negative influence over Sarah. His presence in her life intensified her rebellion and made her feel she needed to protect this relationship at all costs. Bruno's testimony that Sarah hated her father and talked about shooting him, while potentially an attempt to save his own skin, also serves as a glimpse into the escalation of violent thought she may have shared with him. The full extent of Bruno's influence may never be completely known, but it's clear he was a central figure in this drama, a catalyst for Sarah's extreme decisions. He represented the escape she so desperately desired, and the threat of losing him was what pushed her to the point of no return. The final trigger, the threat of deportation. The situation reached its breaking point the night before the murders. Alan Johnson, exasperated and determined to protect his daughter, confronted Sarah and Bruno. He threatened to report Bruno to the police for statutory rape or assault on a minor, and, more crucially, for his irregular immigration status, which would lead to his deportation. For Sarah, this threat wasn't just about Bruno, it was about the destruction of her idealized future. She saw Bruno's deportation as the end of her dream of living a happy life with him, away from her parents' rules and control. This threat, coming from her own father, was the final trigger that pushed her to desperate action. In her immature adolescent mind, under immense pressure, eliminating her parents seemed like the only solution to preserve her romance and her freedom. Sarah's mind, vulnerability and fantasy. Sarah's psychology in the period leading up to the crime is complex and disturbing. Emotional vulnerability. We know Sarah was in therapy and taking antidepressants. This indicates she was already struggling with mental health issues, making her more susceptible to extreme thoughts and a reduced capacity to cope with stress and conflict in a healthy way. Hate and anger. Bruno Santos's testimony that Sarah hated her father and talked about shooting him reveals the depth of her anger and resentment. While teenagers can express anger in exaggerated ways, these words, in the context of escalating tensions, were an alarming sign of hostility that went beyond common rebellion. The perfect crime fantasy. Sarah was an avid fan of true crime and murder mysteries. In her immature mind, perhaps she imagined she could orchestrate the perfect plot to get rid of her parents and live out her fantasy with Bruno. This exposure to true crime media, combined with her vulnerability and desperation, may have created a false sense of knowledge and control, leading her to believe she could commit the crime and get away with it. The story of Sarah Marie Johnson is a dark case study of how adolescent passion, rebellion, family conflicts, and psychological vulnerability can mix into an explosive cocktail, leading to an unimaginable tragedy. The before of the crime does not exonerate her, but it offers us a window into the internal and external forces that led her to cross an irreversible line. We've deconstructed Sarah Marie Johnson's mistakes and delved into the complex tensions that led her to commit such an unimaginable crime. But at Voices of the Vanished, our analysis doesn't end with the conviction. The real question that drives us is, beyond the crime, what could have been different? Could this tragedy have been avoided? And what lessons can we extract so that other families don't face a similar fate? Let's revisit the critical points and explore what could have changed the course of this story. 1. The warning signs. Looking for the invisible. Sarah's story is full of warning signs that, in retrospect, seem glaring. Her increasing rebellion, her involvement with Bruno Santos, the lies, the heated arguments with her parents, and crucially the fact that she was in therapy and taking antidepressants. What could have been different? Society, families, and even mental health professionals need to be more attentive to signs of distress and anger in adolescence. Rebellion is common, but when it manifests with talk of hatred or violence, or when it's accompanied by mental health issues, it cannot be underestimated. Deeper intervention, more rigorous monitoring, or more effective communication about the seriousness of the situation could have been crucial. The question is, do we take what goes on in the minds of our young people seriously enough? 2. Firearm accessibility, a latent risk. The .25 caliber rifle, the murder weapon, was accessible in the guest house on the Johnson property. In a family environment already fraught with tension and with an emotionally distressed teenager, the presence of a firearm becomes an immense risk factor. What could have been different? The responsibility for the safe storage of firearms is a central theme here. In homes with adolescents, especially those showing vulnerability or problematic behavior, firearm accessibility must be a primary concern. Measures such as locked safes, trigger locks, or the complete removal of firearms from the home could have prevented Sarah from having the means to commit the crime in the heat of the moment. 3. Family communication and conflict mediation, bridges instead of walls, and the psychology of approach. The conflict between Sarah and her parents over Bruno Santos escalated to a point of no return. The rigid prohibition and the threat of deportation, though motivated by parental love and concern, were the final catalyst for Sarah. What could have been different? Here, the psychology of the parental approach comes into play. Alan Johnson, the father, acted with the intention of protecting his daughter, but his strategy of direct confrontation and the threat of Bruno's deportation may have been counterproductive. Instead of pushing Bruno away so abruptly and confrontationally, which only solidified Sarah's stance by his side, a more strategic approach could have been considered. Imagine if Alan had tried to approach Bruno, understanding the situation more calmly, perhaps even pretending to accept the relationship temporarily. This could have lessened Sarah's resistance and the feeling that she needed to fight against her parents. At the same time, he could have investigated Bruno anonymously, gathering evidence of his drug involvement or immigration status, and then acted legally without Sarah feeling that her parents were destroying her dream. This is not an easy situation for any parent, but the lack of a more psychological approach and the choice for direct confrontation ultimately isolated Sarah further, pushing her to a desperate decision. Setting boundaries is necessary, but how those boundaries are communicated and the search for joint solutions or even indirect strategies can make all the difference, preventing the teenager from feeling cornered and without options. 4. Mental health and adequate support, an overlooked priority and parental responsibility. Sarah was undergoing treatment for mental health issues, consulting a psychologist and taking antidepressants. This, in itself, was a sign that she was struggling. However, The mere existence of treatment does not guarantee a solution to the problem. What could have been different? Adolescent mental health needs to be treated with the utmost seriousness, and this goes far beyond simply handing off a child to specialists. It is fundamental that young people receive not only treatment, but also continuous and active accompaniment from their parents. Often what we see is that parents, preoccupied with their own dilemmas and routines, send their children to psychologists and psychiatrists, pay for sessions, and believe the problem is solved. But are they monitoring their child's progress? Are they standing by their children? Or are they abandoning them to the care of third parties, often oblivious to the depth of the problem, while they worry about their own issues? The truth is that an adolescent's mental health is a reflection of the environment they live in. Many parents refer their children to specialists, when in reality, they themselves need guidance and support to deal with family dynamics and the young person's emotional needs. Family therapy, active engagement in sessions, when appropriate, and constant loving vigilance are as important as medication or individual therapy. The absence of genuine parental involvement can turn treatment into an empty formality, leaving the adolescent even more isolated in their struggle. The final message: the invisible within the home. The case of Sarah Marie Johnson is a dark and powerful reminder that violence doesn't always come from outside. Often it brews in silence within the walls of a home, fueled by unresolved tensions, untreated mental health issues, and a lack of communication. In today's video, by deconstructing these crimes, we seek not only to understand what happened, but also to illuminate the paths that could have led to a different outcome. It is a call for vigilance, empathy, and the courage to look for the signs that, at times, we prefer not to see. It is an invitation for each of us to reflect on the dynamics in our own homes and communities, and on how we can act to prevent the invisible from becoming irreversible. The case of Sarah Marie Johnson is a disturbing reminder that the greatest tragedies can arise from the most intimate tensions, misunderstanding, and desperate choices. At Voices of the Vanished, we deconstruct this story not to judge, but to understand the human complexities and systemic failures that can lead to such a devastating outcome. We've seen Sarah's amateurish mistakes, which sealed her fate. We've explored the bad boy love and Bruno's influence, adolescent rebellion, and the fragility of her mental health. And most importantly, we've reflected on what could have been different: family communication, firearm storage, and parental responsibility in their children's mental health. This is a story that forces us to look inward, at the dynamics of our own homes, and at the signs that, at times, we prefer to ignore. Now, we want to hear your voice. Do you believe Sarah Marie Johnson is capable of genuine remorse for her actions? Should her young age at the time of the crime be a mitigating factor for a life sentence? And what is your opinion on Bruno Santos's influence? Do you think he manipulated her more than is known, or did she act on her own, driven by a fantasy? Leave your opinion in the comments below. Your perspective is fundamental to our crime deconstruction community. If you value deep analyses like this that go beyond the crime, please like this video and subscribe to Voices of the Vanished so you don't miss our next investigations. Thank you for joining us on this dark yet necessary journey. Until the next deconstruction.